Okay, we're talking to Art Hazelwood, who is the curator of the San Francisco show of Hobos to Street People, which is a comparison of homelessness in the Depression and today. And we are in the California Historical Society at 678 Mission, I think.
I believe that's right.
Yeah, and Art is going to explain his ideas about this show, why he put it together, and he's going to talk a little bit about the pictures behind him.
Yeah, well, I guess I should start by saying this show was organized around the idea of discussions between historians and homeless rights activists who were talking about the 75th anniversary of the New Deal, 1933, and then 2008 was the 75th anniversary. So started with this idea of how could I put an art show together that would make that comparison. And I was very familiar with work from contemporary artists because I've been involved with the Street Sheet and the Street Spirit homeless street papers in the Bay Area. And then I also thought, well, if I were to be able to package a show like this and put it on the road, it would be very appropriate for our times. This was actually before the mortgage meltdown started. But I think for anybody who's been involved with any issues around homelessness, they've seen parallels or at least unpleasant relationships between the Depression and the present. So it didn't take the mortgage meltdown to see these parallels.
What do you mean unpleasant relationship between the Depression era and the present?
Well, I mean, only the unpleasant part is that the government did something then and has done nothing now. The other unpleasantry of it is that homelessness is again on the rise, like it was in the Depression. I think statistics I've seen are something like 25% unemployment during the Depression, but they developed safety nets. When Social Security started, they had a program that lasted only for a couple of years, but they actually had a federal program to address homelessness in the Depression.
And this was Roosevelt administration.
This was the Roosevelt administration. It lasted from 1933 to 1935. This program called, what is it called? Federal Transient Services. That was the first federal program. So one of the things that I wanted to point out in the show is the parallels in the conditions of people living in homelessness between then and now. I also wanted to show the lack of parallel between the Depression response by the federal government and the response basically since 1983, when homelessness started.
Which is nothing.
Which has been very minimal.
Progressive underfunding of affordable housing.
And the defunding of several of these programs that started during the Depression.
So that there's now no funding of affordable housing, right? And according to Paul Bowden's charts.
Well, I mean, there is still some funding for HUD, but it's been drastically reduced.
Right.
So I have heard that all funding for through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, all funding for rural public housing has been defunded as of last year or 2 years ago,
right.
Very end of the Bush administration.
And there's actually a piece in the show about that, which is
we have a couple pieces that illustrate this history. And part of the idea of the show is to say also that there were artists at that time, and there are artists now, who have been working on issues of homelessness. How did they use their artwork? Did they just make it and put it away in the studio? Well, the focus of the show was to be on how artists actually took the artwork that they made and put it to some use. So Dorothea Lange, during the Depression, her photographs were used before congressional testimony to aid in the funding of the different resettlement administration programs.
So it was an integral part of the government's, her photographs were an integral part of the government's response to all these people who've been displaced. She was actually making a record of it.
She was making a record of it, and she was also acting as a propagandist for government programs that were aiding people.
But she was paid.
She was a paid propagandist.
A stunning concept.
Well, and a lot of artists in the show were paid by the Federal Work Progress Administration, the federal arts program in that.
Right.
Artists were paid not by what they made, but just that they made art. So if you were hired by the Federal Arts Project, you would make prints, for example, if you're in the print program, and you would be paid a certain amount of money every month, the same amount of money. And those artists organized themselves at that time. They didn't have the competition of fighting over the gallery system. They organized themselves together, and they put together exhibitions. There was a show called A Million Houses in New York City at Rockefeller Center, of all places.
They had some work of theirs is at Coit Tower. That was part of it as well. Could you talk about these pieces behind you?
Right. So
in relation to what you've said.
Albert Potter was a WPA artist. He was hired by the WPA in New York City, and I think this print really shows off the idea that the Depression was not a period, as it is in many people's imagination or their memory, when everybody was all together, everybody pulled together, and we all struggled together. The print clearly shows this disparity of wealth during the Depression. And the print is called Brother Can You Spare a Dime. It was named after the Yip Harburg song that was published a few years earlier, which talks about the veterans returning from World War I and their lack of response by the government to them. So if you look at the gesture that he has in that the outstretched hand, and then you look at the next piece on the wall to your left here.
Right here.
Ed Gould, contemporary artist, I think that gesture travels across the ages between the Depression and the present quite well.
The hand gesture,
the
outstretched
hand.
Okay.
Yeah. They're both relief prints from, one's a woodcut and one's a lino cut.
Let me get right in front of it here. Yeah.
And Ed Gould has been active working with the Street Sheet and the Coalition on Homelessness. He's worked with different kinds of shelter organizations as well. So his artwork's just one part of his interest in working on issues about homelessness. And if you look at this image over here.
Okay, this is Gold Digger.
Gold Digger is Lee Friedlander, who was born
trying
in
to get
Latvia. It says there, right there, born in Latvia.
Born in Latvia.
And arrived in the United States right at the beginning of the Depression. And if this image were done today, it would be obviously a shopping cart. But instead he's using a wheelbarrow or a cart of some kind, the work tools for homeless people at that time. And I always like to contrast that with the piece behind you by Christine Hanlon, which is people on the 3rd Street in San Francisco going to a recycling center with their shopping carts. The idea of homelessness being that these carts are a tool that people work with.
We'll talk about Christine's piece in another short clip.
Okay.
So, to be continued.